The fluorescent hum of St. Jude's Hospital was a familiar lullaby to Sarah, 24 years old, with a spirit as bright as her scrubs were white. She moved through the night shift with a quiet efficiency that belied her youth. Her current charge, room 37, housed Arthur Henderson, a man whose eyes held the distant, knowing gaze of 1,000 sunrises and sunsets. A decorated Marine veteran, Mr. Henderson was in for a routine checkup, but Sarah had come to cherish their nightly conversations, fragments of history and wisdom shared over cups of lukewarm tea. He was more than a patient. He was a mentor, a grandfather figure, a living testament to a generation of quiet heroes. Tonight, however, the usual calm was an illusion. A storm brewed outside, mirroring the unease that had settled over Sarah since the late-night admission of a particularly shifty visitor to another floor. She dismissed it as exhaustion, but the hairs on her neck prickled. Mr. Henderson, usually asleep by now, was awake, his gaze fixed on the darkened window, a subtle tension in his jaw. "Can't sleep, Mr. Henderson?" Sarah asked softly, adjusting his blanket. He turned, a faint, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Just old ghosts, Sarah. They tend to walk on nights like these." His voice, usually a gravelly whisper, held an edge of something she couldn't quite place. A sudden, jarring clang echoed from the hallway, followed by hushed, urgent voices. Sarah's heart leaped. This wasn't the usual hospital shuffle. She moved to the door, peering out cautiously. Two figures, clad in dark, anonymous clothing, were forcing open the supply closet across the hall. Their movements too deliberate, too practiced for ordinary intruders. One carried something long and metallic. "Stay here, Mr. Henderson," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with a fear she'd never known. "I'll get security." But before she could even reach the call button, the door to room 307 burst open. The two figures, now unmasked, were inside, their faces grim, their eyes cold. The long object in one man's hand was undeniably a weapon. "Henderson," one of them growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You've been harder to find than a ghost." Arthur Henderson, despite his age and infirmity, pushed himself up, his eyes narrowing. "You're late to the party, boys, and you've picked the wrong dance floor." Sarah, frozen for a split second, reacted on instinct. She threw herself between the armed men and Mr. Henderson's bed, her arms outstretched, a flimsy shield of courage against a storm of malice. "Get out. This is a hospital," she cried, her voice trembling but resolute. The first shot cracked through the sterile air, deafening. Sarah felt a searing pain in her shoulder, a hot, blossoming agony that stole her breath. She staggered, but remained upright, defiant. Another shot, then another, a horrifying staccato symphony of destruction. Each impact was a hammer blow, tearing through her flesh, stealing her strength, yet her mind screamed. Protective. She heard Mr. Henderson's guttural cry, a sound of pure anguish and rage. The world blurred into a kaleidoscope of pain and fading light. She felt herself falling, the cold linoleum rushing up to meet her. The last thing she saw was Mr. Henderson, his face contorted with a grief that transcended the physical, reaching for her, a silent plea in his eyes. Then, darkness. 15 times. 15 times the bullets had ripped through Sergeant, a young nurse who had dared to stand between evil and the veteran she protected. The attackers, their mission seemingly accomplished, vanished into the night as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind a scene of unspeakable horror. Chaos erupted. Nurses screamed, doctors rushed, and the hospital descended into a frantic struggle for Sarah's life. She was rushed to surgery, her body a canvas of wounds, her pulse a faint flutter. Mr. Henderson, miraculously untouched by the bullets, was a man transformed. The quiet veteran was gone, replaced by a fierce, burning intensity. He sat by Sarah's bedside in the ICU, his hand gripping hers, a silent vigil. The news spread like wildfire, not just through the hospital, but through channels far more clandestine. A young nurse, shot defending a veteran. The story was picked up by local news, then national. A tragic tale of selfless heroism. But what the public didn't know was the full weight of Arthur Henderson's past. He wasn't just a veteran, he was the veteran, a legend, a ghost, a man whose shadow stretched across decades of classified operations, a founding member of a unit so elite, its very existence was a whisper. He was Arthur Ghost Henderson, and the men who had just tried to silence him were remnants of a past he thought he'd buried. The information reached them through an encrypted channel, a single, terse message. Nightingale down, ghosts charge. The response was immediate, visceral. Across continents, in training exercises, on leave in the quiet solitude of their homes, a brotherhood stirred. They were the silent warriors, the tip of the spear, the guardians of the shadows. They were the Navy SEALs, and Arthur Henderson was one of their own, a patriarch, a living embodiment of their creed. 24 hours, that's all it took. 24 hours for the message to propagate, for the orders to be cut, for the brotherhood to mobilize. From Coronado to Virginia Beach, from Okinawa to the Persian Gulf. They came, not a handful, not a squad, but a legion, 500 strong, 500 shadows, converging on a small, unsuspecting city. They arrived not with a fanfare, but with the quiet precision of a well-oiled machine. Black SUVs, unmarked vans, private jets touching down at obscure airfields. They melted into the urban landscape, an unseen force. Their presence felt more than seen. They didn't wear uniforms. They wore the grim determination of men on a mission. Their objective was singular: find those who had dared to harm one of their own, and the innocent who had stood with them. The local police, overwhelmed and bewildered by the sudden influx of highly trained, unidentifiable men who moved with an almost supernatural efficiency, were quickly briefed. A grim-faced man, identifying himself only as Commander Hayes, presented credentials that made the police chief's jaw drop. "We're here for Arthur Henderson," Hayes stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "And for the nurse who saved his life, those who did this will answer." The SEALs didn't wait for warrants or red tape. They moved with a surgical precision that bypassed conventional law enforcement. They had their own intelligence, their own networks, their own methods. They traced the attackers' movements, piecing together fragments of information from surveillance cameras, discarded shell casings, and the faint whispers of the underworld. They were hunting, and their prey had nowhere to hide. The perpetrators, a small, desperate cell of mercenaries with old grudges against Henderson, had underestimated the depth of his connections. They thought they had dealt with an old man and a naive nurse. They had, instead, awakened a sleeping giant. Meanwhile, back at St. Jude's, Sarah Jenkins fought for her life. The hospital staff, though skilled, were awestruck by the silent, watchful presence of the SEALs, who now guarded her room. They were a constant, reassuring presence, a wall of unwavering protection. Commander Hayes himself visited a man of few words, but his gaze held a profound respect for the young nurse. He spoke to Mr. Henderson in hushed tones. Words, Sarah, even in her drug-induced haze, couldn't quite decipher, but she felt the weight of their shared history. Days turned into a week. Sarah's condition slowly stabilized. The pain was immense, but the knowledge that she had protected Mr. Henderson, that she had done something, fueled her will to live. She learned, in fragments, of the SEALs' relentless pursuit. They didn't just find the attackers, they dismantled their entire network, exposing a web of illicit activities and old vendettas. Justice, swift and uncompromising, was served. The details were kept from the public, but the message was clear: you do not touch their own. One afternoon, as Sarah lay in her hospital bed, finally conscious and able to speak more than a whisper, Mr. Henderson sat beside her, his hand still clasped in hers. "You saved my life, Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You showed more courage than most men I've known." Sarah managed a weak smile. "You're worth saving, Mr. Henderson." He nodded, then looked towards the door where a silent SEAL stood guard. "They came for you, Sarah, because you stood for me. That's their code: loyalty, honor, protection." Sarah Jenkins, the young nurse who had been shot 15 times, became a quiet legend within a community few knew existed. She didn't receive medals or public accolades from the military, but she received something far more profound: the unwavering respect and gratitude of men who lived by a code older than any law. Her recovery was long and arduous, but she was never alone. The SEALs, though they eventually faded back into the shadows, left behind a legacy of protection and a bond that transcended the battlefield. Sarah had stood for a veteran, and in return, a legion had risen for her, proving that some codes, some loyalties, are truly unbreakable. She was their nightingale, and they, her silent, unwavering guardians. The fluorescent hum of St. Jude's Hospital was a familiar lullaby to Sarah Jenkins, a constant, low thrumming that had woven itself into the fabric of her life over the past 2 years. At 24, with a spirit as bright as her scrubs were white, she moved through the night shift with a quiet efficiency that belied her youth. She wasn't just a nurse. She was a quiet anchor in the chaotic tides of illness and recovery, a steady hand, a calming voice. Before nursing, she'd considered teaching, but the raw, immediate impact she could make on someone's life, the tangible difference of easing pain or bringing comfort, had drawn her inexorably to the hospital's wards. The solitude of the night shift suited her, offering moments of quiet reflection amidst the urgent calls, allowing her to truly connect with her patients. Her current charge, room 37, housed Arthur Henderson, a man whose eyes held the distant, knowing gaze of 1,000 sunrises and sunsets, lines of experience etched around them, hinting at stories she could only imagine. A decorated Marine veteran, Mr. Henderson was in for a routine checkup, a battery of tests for an old injury flaring up. But Sarah had come to cherish their nightly conversations. They were fragments of history and wisdom, shared over cups of lukewarm, hospital-grade tea that somehow tasted better when he was the one pouring. He spoke of vast, desolate landscapes and the quiet camaraderie of men who faced impossible odds, always in metaphors she only partially understood. He was more than a patient. He was a mentor, a grandfather figure she never had, a living testament to a generation of quiet heroes who carried the weight of the world with stoic grace. Tonight, however, the usual calm was an illusion, a thin veneer over a simmering unease. A storm brewed outside, the wind howling around the corners of the hospital, mirroring the subtle disquiet that had settled over Sarah since the late-night admission of a particularly shifty visitor to another floor, a man with eyes that seemed to constantly scan, even in repose. She dismissed it as simple exhaustion, the usual weariness that came with chasing dwindling hours of sleep. But now, the hairs on her neck prickled, a primal alarm bell ringing faintly. Mr. Henderson, usually asleep by now, a soft snore, a familiar comfort, was wide awake. His gaze was fixed on the darkened window, a subtle tension in his jaw that Sarah hadn't seen before. "Can't sleep, Mr. Henderson?" Sarah asked softly, her voice a gentle inquiry against the rising wind outside. She adjusted a thin hospital-issued blanket around his shoulders, noting the way his muscles seemed coiled even as he lay still. He turned, a faint, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Just old ghosts, Sarah?" he rumbled, his voice like gravel shifting underfoot. "They tend to walk on nights like these, when the wind howls just so, reminds a man of things best left buried." His eyes, usually softened by age, held an edge of something she couldn't quite place. A flicker of steel, a shadow of long past battles. A sudden, jarring clang echoed from the hallway, sharp and metallic, cutting through the hospital's usual hushed symphony. It was followed almost immediately by hushed, urgent voices. Too low to decipher, too tense to ignore. Sarah's heart leaped, a frantic bird trapped in her ribs. This wasn't the usual hospital shuffle. No gurneys clattering, no nurses discussing charts. This was something else. She moved to the door, peering out cautiously, her hand hovering over the frame. Two figures, clad in dark, anonymous clothing that seemed to absorb the dim hallway light, were forcing open the supply closet directly across the hall. Their movements were too deliberate, too practiced for ordinary intruders. One carried something long and metallic, partially obscured by his body, but its shape was chillingly familiar. "Stay here, Mr. Henderson," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with a fear she'd never known, a cold dread seeping into her veins. "I'll get security." Her mind raced, trying to recall the exact procedure, the nearest panic button. But before she could even reach the call button on the wall beside the door to room 307 burst open with a splintering crash. The two figures, now unmasked, were inside, their faces grim, their eyes cold and devoid of human warmth. The long object in one man's hand was undeniably a weapon, glinting dully under the fluorescent lights. The air in the room seemed to crackle with menace. "Henderson," one of them growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated in Sarah's chest. "You've been harder to find than a ghost." His gaze flickered to Sarah for a split second, dismissive, before returning to the veteran. Arthur Henderson, despite his age and infirmity, the force still taped to his arm, pushed himself up with a surprising surge of strength. His eyes narrowed, reflecting the gun's cold gleam. "You're late to the party, boys," he said, his voice now stripped of its usual gravelly warmth, replaced by a steely resolve. "And you've picked the wrong dance floor." There was a dangerous calm in his tone, a stillness that belied the tension in the room. Sarah, frozen for a split second, her mind grappling with the sudden, brutal reality of the situation, reacted on pure instinct. Her training kicked in, not the medical kind, but a deeper human impulse to protect the vulnerable. She threw herself between the armed men and Mr. Henderson's bed, her arms outstretched, a flimsy shield of courage against a storm of malice. "Get out, this is a hospital," she cried, her voice trembling but resolute, a desperate defiance echoing in the sterile room. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, to hide. But the image of Mr. Henderson's weary but noble face held her rooted. The first shot cracked through the sterile air, deafening in its intensity, a thunderclap that seemed to rip the very fabric of the night. Sarah felt a searing pain in her left shoulder, a hot, blossoming agony that stole her breath and made her teeth clench. She staggered, the impact throwing her off balance, but miraculously, she remained upright, defiant. Another shot, then another, a horrifying staccato symphony of destruction that reverberated in her ears. Each impact was a hammer blow, tearing through her flesh, stealing her strength. Yet her mind, even as it reeled from the pain, screamed a single, desperate command. "Protect him." She heard Mr. Henderson's guttural cry, a sound of pure anguish and rage, as if torn from the depths of his soul. The world blurred into a kaleidoscope of pain and fading light, colors bleeding into one another. The sharp scent of ozone mingled with the metallic temps of blood. She felt herself falling, the cold linoleum rushing up to meet her with an icy embrace. The last thing she saw was Mr. Henderson, his face contorted with a grief that transcended the physical, reaching for her, a silent plea in his eyes, a desperate hand outstretched that she couldn't grasp. Then, darkness descended, absolute and suffocating. 15 times. 15 times the bullets had ripped through Sarah Jenkins, a young nurse who had dared to stand between evil and the veterans she protected. Her body, a testament to selfless courage, lay broken amidst the shattered piece of room 370 attackers. Their mission seemingly accomplished, their grim faces betraying no emotion, vanished into the night as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind a scene of unspeakable horror, a testament to their brutality. Chaos erupted. The sharp cracks of gunfire had shattered the night's illusion of safety. Nurses screamed, their calls for help echoing down the corridors. Doctors, roused from their brief naps or focused work, rushed towards the sound, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. The hospital, usually a place of quiet healing, descended into a frantic struggle for Sarah's life, a desperate dance against time and loss. She was rushed to surgery, her body a canvas of wounds, each one a testament to her bravery. Her pulse, a faint flutter, a whisper against the roaring storm of her injuries. Mr. Henderson, miraculously untouched by the bullets, was a man transformed. The quiet veteran, the kindly grandfather figure, was gone, replaced by a fierce, burning intensity, a primal fury that radiated from him. He followed the gurney carrying Sarah, his gaze never leaving her, a silent, grim guardian. He sat by Sarah's bedside in the ICU, his hand grip in hers, a silent vigil that spoke volumes. His eyes fixed on the fragile rise and fall of her chest, a stark contrast to the storm raging within him.